Hi everyone, and welcome to another video on my channel. I'm so glad you're here with me today, because you're about to be treated to a story that is one of the most horrifying and infamous crime cases of the 20th century. Today we're going to take a look at a man whose name terrified an entire German city and whose crimes shocked the world. Peter Kürten, who went down in history as the Vampire of Dusseldorf. Peter Kürten was born in the year 1892, and his life story is an example of how a man can slip into absolute darkness. Between the years 1929 and 1930, he terrorized the streets of Dusseldorf with a series of brutal murders and attacks that had one common element: incredible cruelty and often drinking the blood of his victims. Yes, you heard right. That's why the media gave him that terrifying nickname. What makes this case so fascinating, yet disturbing? It's the combination of Kürten's cold-bloodedness, his ability to lead a double life, and the way he managed to elude justice for years. His story changed the way the police approached the investigation of serial killers, and still serves as study material for criminologists and psychologists today. So get your drinks ready, get comfortable, and let's explore together the dark mind of one of history's most dangerous serial killers. And don't forget, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more dark crime cases. So let's get to it. If we want to delve into the dark mind of Peter Kürten, we have to start where it all began, in his childhood. And I have to tell you, what you're about to learn will show you just how devastating a toxic family environment can be on the formation of the human psyche. Peter Kürten was born on the 26th of May, in the year 1892, in Mülheim am Rhein, which is now part of Cologne. He grew up in a family that was literally the definition of dysfunction. He was the third of 13 children. Imagine that overcrowded household where so many siblings shared attention. His father was an alcoholic and abusive in the worst sense of the word. He wasn't the kind of father who would just raise his voice after a few beers. No, this man was a real bully who terrorized the whole family. He regularly beat his wife and children, often for no rational reason. The Kürten family home was not a place of safety and love, but rather a prison of fear and violence. Little Peter was forced to witness various forms of domestic violence. He saw his father brutally beat his mother, heard her screaming and crying. Imagine what it must be like for a child to sit in the corner of a room and watch a man who is supposed to be the protector of the family turn into a monster. But it wasn't just physical violence. The father also sexually abused the mother in front of the children. Yes, you heard that right. He had no inhibitions and didn't care that his children were present for these acts. It is even said that he attempted to sexually abuse one of his daughters, which led to a lawsuit. The father was eventually convicted, and the family was temporarily separated from him. For little Peter, this meant growing up in an environment where there was no normality, no love, no security. His idea of interpersonal relationships was distorted from the start. Violence was something common, something every day. And you know what the worst part of it is? A child in such an environment has no comparison. He can't know that this isn't normal because it's all he knows. They lived in a small apartment where all 15 members of the family were crammed into 1 or 2 rooms. There was no privacy. There was no peace. Poverty was another constant in their lives. The father laundered his money, and the family often did not have enough money for basic needs. In such an environment, it is not surprising that Peter began to exhibit disturbing behavior very early on. Even as a young child, at the age of 9 or 10, he began to show tendencies towards aggression and antisocial behavior. His first offenses began with theft. He stole food, small items, money, anything he could find. At first it may have been motivated by the poverty of the family, but over time it grew into something more. He stole for the thrill, for the feeling of power over the situation. It was one of the few things he could control in his chaotic life. But let's go back to the aggression. Peter wasn't just a thief. He began abusing animals at an early age, which, as many of you may know, is one of the classic warning signs of future violent behavior. He tortured dogs, cats, and other animals he met. He observed their suffering and, according to later accounts, found it arousing. When he was 9 years old, something happened that would have a profound effect on his future development. He befriended a local dog catcher, a man whose job it was to catch stray animals. This man was a troublesome character in his own right, and showed little Peter things that no child should see. He taught him how to torture and kill dogs. Peter was fascinated by the whole process, the way the animal suffered, the way it struggled, the way it gradually lost its strength. This man was actually the first mentor in Peter's dark journey. He showed him that violence could be a source of pleasure, that power over another's life and death could bring satisfaction. Peter also began spending time by the Rhine River, where he learned to swim. But here too his darker side emerged. When he was about 9 years old, he allegedly threw 2 of his friends off a raft into the water. One of them drowned. Peter later claimed that while the other children thought the boy had simply disappeared underwater, he knew he had sent him there. And when the second boy tried to save the first, Peter pushed him under the water as well. Imagine the cold-bloodedness. A 9-year-old child actively causing the death of another child. If this story is true, and there are doubts because Peter tended to exaggerate his actions at times, then we are dealing with a child who, at such an early age, crossed a line that most people never cross. Peter's criminal behavior could not go unnoticed forever. When he was 13, he ran away from home for the first time. No wonder he wanted to escape the hell he'd grown up in. But freedom on the streets only brought more problems. He stole for a living, slept wherever he could, and very quickly got into conflict with the law. At 16, he was convicted of theft and fraud for the first time. He got 4 years in prison. Imagine a 16-year-old boy sentenced to 4 years. What do you think happens to a troubled teenager in prison in the early 20th century? There's certainly no help, therapy, or rehabilitation to be found there. No, prison was a hard, brutal place that didn't make him a better person, but a worse one. In prison, Peter was repeatedly punished for breaking the rules. He was rebellious, refusing to obey authority. And you know what happened to disobedient prisoners? They were sent to solitary confinement, an isolated cell where you spend days, weeks, sometimes months alone in the dark. Peter spent a total of more than 2 years in solitary confinement during his various stints in prison. 2 years in isolation. 2 years where he only had time for his own thoughts. And what thoughts did a man like Peter Kürten have? He later admitted that it was during these long hours of solitude that he began to develop his darkest fantasies. He imagined scenes of violence, torture, murder. He visualized how he would inflict pain, how people would suffer. These fantasies became more and more intense and detailed. He masturbated to images of brutal violence. His sexuality became intrinsically linked to the aggression and suffering of others. Prison taught him neither pity nor empathy. It only taught him how to be more careful, how to better hide his true self. When he was released, he was even more dangerous than before. So there you have it, the childhood and early adulthood of Peter Kürten. A toxic family, an abusive father, a lack of love and security, an early fascination with violence, the torture of animals, the possible murder of his classmates, and finally a prison sentence that made him an even bigger monster. All these factors combined to create a man who would later become one of the most dangerous serial killers in history. It's a scary story, but an important one. It shows us how fragile the human psyche can be, and how devastating the consequences of child neglect and abuse can be. Kürten's criminal career as a rapist began much earlier than most people think. Let's talk about the period that preceded his most notorious Dusseldorf crimes. In February of the year 1913, an incident took place that many consider to be Kürten's first real attempt at murder with violence. At the time, he was living in Cologne and working as a petty thief. On the 9th of February, he broke into an inn in Cologne-Mulheim. He went there ostensibly for a robbery, but found something much more interesting: a sleeping girl. In the room above the inn, 10-year-old Christine Klein was asleep. Kürten sneaked up on the sleeping girl and began to strangle her. Then he pulled out a knife and cut her throat. But he wasn't satisfied with one blow. He stabbed her again behind the ear. Blood spurted onto the bed, onto the walls. And you know what Kürten did? He stood there and watched. He was fascinated by the way the blood flowed, the way her little body trembled. Christine died from the attack. Her father found her in the morning in a pool of blood. The police were shocked at the brutality of the act. The investigation focused on various suspects. Even the girl's uncle, Otto Klein, was wrongly accused and convicted. He spent some time in prison before he was finally released. No one would have guessed that the real culprit was a young man who had since disappeared from the city. Kürten later admitted that he returned to the scene of the crime the following day. He sat in a cafe opposite the inn and listened to people talking about the murder. It excited him. He said he read all the newspaper articles about the case and masturbated at the memory of the girl dying. This incident was followed by a period in which Kürten was repeatedly imprisoned for various offenses. But when he was out, he continued his attacks. In the year 1913, he also attacked several women during robberies. He used strangulation, blows to the head, but these women survived. Between 1913 and 1921, he spent most of his time behind bars. But after his release in 1921, he began to settle down. He moved to Altenburg, and there he met a woman named Auguste. He married her in the year 1923. Auguste was a former prostitute who had had a hard life herself. In public, Kürten came across as a decent, hard-working man. He worked in a factory, went to church, was polite to his neighbors. But underneath the surface was something dark. In the year 1925, the family moved to Dusseldorf, and it was here that the worst chapter of Kürten's life began. Between the years 1925 and 1928, sporadic attacks occurred. Women were attacked in the streets, in parks, in deserted places. Kürten strangled them, beat them with his fists, sometimes stabs them with a knife or scissors. Most of these women survived, but they were traumatized.
They described their attacker as a calm, decent-looking man who suddenly turned into a monster. Now let's look at what made Kürten's crimes so specific and horrifying. His modus operandi had several distinctive elements that set him apart from other rapists. The first, and perhaps most famous feature, was biting. Kürten bit his victims. He left teeth marks on their bodies, on their necks, on their shoulders, on their breasts, on their thighs. It wasn't just any bite. He bit so hard that he often broke the skin and blood gushed out. And that was what turned him on the most. He himself later admitted that drinking blood gave him sexual satisfaction. He put his mouth to the wounds and drank the blood of his victims. That's why he was nicknamed the Vampire of Dusseldorf. It wasn't just journalistic hyperbole. He actually drank human blood. He said the taste of blood in his mouth made him orgasmic. The second characteristic element was the wounds made with a knife or scissors.
Kürten used a variety of tools: pocket knives, kitchen knives, secateurs, even a carpenter's hammer. But the way he used them was always similar. He stabbed his victims repeatedly, often in the neck, chest, and abdomen. But what's perhaps most frightening is the way he returned the blows. After the first stab, he would often stop and watch the blood drain. Then he stabbed again, and again. Sometimes he would pause between stabs, as if to savor each moment. He didn't stab in affect or in anger. He did it methodically, controlled, almost ritualistically. The third element was what I call dissecting the wounds. After an attack, Kürten often returned to the body or the scene of the crime. If the victim was still alive, he would sometimes spread the wounds with his fingers to see inside. He was fascinated by what the human body looked like from the inside. He would stick his fingers into the wounds, widen them, watch the blood pulse out. In some cases, he would return to dead bodies hours or days after the fact. In one case, it is documented that he returned to the body of a child he had buried, dug it up, and stabbed it again. The dead body also excited him, the memory of the murder. His attacks also had a sexual dimension, although there was not always direct sexual contact. He often ejaculated while stabbing or strangling. He said that the orgasm during the killing was more intense than anything else. Sometimes he masturbated directly over the victim's body. In other cases, he reached orgasm simply by observing the suffering. Who were the people Kürten attacked? Let's take a look at his pattern of victim selection, because it also tells us a lot about his psychology. Kürten's victims were extremely diverse, which made his capture even more difficult. He didn't have one clear type of victim, as is common with many serial killers. He attacked young children, teenage girls, adult women, and even men.
He attacked the rich and the poor, the intelligent and the mentally handicapped. Children were frequent targets. Kürten attacked children as young as 5 years old. Little girls were ideal victims for him. They were trusting, weak, unable to defend themselves. He often lured them with the promise of sweets, toys, or simply by pretending to be a kind master who wanted to help them. In the summer of 1929, he attacked several little girls. For example, 5-year-old Gertrude Hamaker and 14-year-old Louise Lenzen were murdered almost on the same day. They were both stabbed in the temples and neck with scissors. Kürten lured them to a gardening colony, where he murdered them and left their bodies. Teenage girls and young women were the next category. They were often workers returning from work late at night, maids, prostitutes, or simply women walking alone in the dark. Kürten watched them, waited for the right moment, and then attacked. Sometimes he first approached them, offered to accompany them, and then took them to a deserted place. Interestingly, Kürten didn't just attack women. He also had men among his victims. This was unusual for serial killers of the time, who usually had a clear gender preference. But for Kürten, the gender identity of the victim was not important. What mattered was the suffering, the blood, the death. Mentally ill or vulnerable people were also among his victims. Kürten could recognize weakness, vulnerability. He sought out people who could not defend themselves well, who might not even be able to describe him accurately. The mentally disabled, the drunk, the homeless, all were potential targets. Geographically, he attacked mainly in Düsseldorf and the surrounding area. He sought out deserted places, parks, gardening colonies, woods on the outskirts of the city, dark alleys. But he wasn't afraid to attack in busier places either, as long as it was dark and no one was around. The timing of the attacks also had a pattern. Most attacks took place in the evening or at night, when there were fewer witnesses. But sometimes he would attack during the day if there was an opportunity. He was an opportunist. When he saw an opportunity, he took it. What is perhaps most frightening about Kürten
is the fact that he led a perfectly normal life between attacks. He would come home to his wife, look into her eyes, eat dinner with her, sleep next to her, and she knew nothing about it. He was a master of disguise, a master of the double life. This was Peter Kürten's first crimes and modus operandi. A brutal, methodical, and frighteningly controlled rapist who enjoyed every moment of his victim's suffering. Now we come to the period when isolated incidents became real terror. The year 1929 brought a wave of violence such as Dusseldorf had never seen before. And the media? They made it a sensation that shocked the whole of Germany. February of the year 1929 was the month when all hell really broke loose. On the 9th of February, exactly 16 years after the murder in Cologne, Kürten attacked a woman named Rosa Oliger. He stabbed her 20 times in the head, chest, and abdomen. He left her dead in Flingern, one of Dusseldorf's districts. The symbolism of this date was not accidental. Kürten deliberately chose it as a kind of anniversary of his first known murder. But February was only the beginning. On the 8th of February, the day before the murder of Rosa Oliger, he tried to set fire to the barn. Fires became another of his obsessions. It thrilled him to watch the flames, the chaos, people running and screaming. He said the idea of people burning alive gave him a sexual satisfaction similar to that of stabbing. On February 13th, he attacked Rudolf Schäfer, a man walking down the street late at night. He stabbed him 20 times with a pair of scissors. Schäfer survived but was seriously injured. This was something new, an attack on a grown man in the middle of the city. Kürten was becoming bolder, more reckless. Then came August. On the 28th of August, Dusseldorf awoke to a nightmare. That day, Kürten murdered 3 people in a matter of hours. First, he came across the sisters Maria and Luisa. Maria was 14, Luisa 5. They were on a pilgrimage in Flehe, a suburb of Dusseldorf. Kürten approached them, offered to show them the way. He took them to a gardening colony and murdered them. He stabbed them repeatedly in the neck and chest. Their small bodies were found the next morning under the bushes. But Kürten wasn't finished yet. That evening he was returning home and met Gertrude Schulte, a 30-year-old maid. He invited her for a walk, took her to the park and stabbed her. But Gertrude was no child. She was stronger and could defend herself. She screamed so loudly that Kürten had to run away. Gertrude survived and was able to describe her attacker. That was the first time the police got a really usable description. September continued at the same pace. On the 30th of September, the maid Ida Reuter was attacked. He hit her in the head with a hammer. Ida died of her injuries. On the same day, he attacked another woman, also with a hammer. This woman survived with a serious skull injury. October brought another wave of horror. On 11th of October, a gardener in Dusseldorf found the corpse of Elizabeth Dorier. 59 hammer wounds. 59! Imagine the rage, the mad energy. Kürten attacked her again and again, even though she was already dead. On October 12th, he attacked a 5-year-old girl named Gertrude Albermann. He murdered her with stabbings and wrapped her body in sacks he left by the city wall. But that wasn't all. He sent a letter to the police with a precise description of where the body would be found. He wanted them to find her quickly.
He wanted to see the city's reaction, read about it in the newspapers. November was relatively quiet, but then another attack came. On November 7th, a hammer attack on 25-year-old Gertrude Hammacher. She survived, but had serious head injuries. In total, during the year 1929 and the beginning of the year 1930, Kürten murdered or attempted to murder dozens of people. The exact number is difficult to determine because not all of the attacks have been reported or linked to his case. Some victims were too afraid to go to the police. Other attacks were initially thought to be isolated incidents. The frequency of attacks increased. There were increasingly shorter intervals between each act. Kürten was like a drug addict in need of an ever higher dose. One attack was no longer enough. He had to attack more often, more brutally, more boldly. Now imagine how it all looked from the point of view of the ordinary people of Dusseldorf. Every morning they opened the newspaper and read about another murder, another attack. The newspapers were full of horrifying headlines. "Another victim of the Dusseldorf murderer," screamed the headlines. "Who will stop this monster?" the newspapers asked. The media had a feast. Every day brought new details, often overly dramatic, often morbidly detailed. Journalists used the most sensational language possible. They wrote about the beast in human form, the vampire who drinks the blood of his victims, the monstrous killer who terrorizes the city. Some newspapers even published illustrations of a dark figure with a knife lurking in the shadows. It wasn't just a local issue. The case made national, even international headlines. Berlin newspapers devoted entire pages to the case. The French, British, and even American press covered it. Dusseldorf became synonymous with horror. Each new attack brought a new wave of articles. Journalists competed to see who could provide the juiciest details. They described the wounds, the amount of blood, the last moments of the victims. It was unethical, but it sold well. Newspaper circulation skyrocketed. The media also speculated on the identity of the killer. They published various theories. Some papers claimed the killer must be a butcher because he was so skilled with a knife. Others said it must be a doctor or someone with knowledge of anatomy. Still others claimed he was a member of the upper classes because he could move through different parts of the city unnoticed. Some newspapers even published profiles of the killer created by various experts. Most of them were completely wrong. One such profile claimed that the killer must be a physically imposing man with wild eyes and a fierce appearance. In reality, Kürten was an unassuming, well-dressed man of average build with a calm demeanor. The impact on the public was devastating. Dusseldorf lived in absolute fear. Streets that used to be crowded in the evening were suddenly deserted. As soon as it got dark, everyone shut themselves in. Parents didn't allow their children out for a moment without supervision. Women were afraid to go out alone. Those who had to leave work late at night went out in groups. Many bought pepper sprays, small knives, or other means of self-defense. Some women even stopped going to work altogether because they were afraid of the journey there and back. Gardening colonies, which used to be popular places for weekend relaxation, turned into scary places. Nobody wanted to go there. The parks were deserted. Every shadow, every sound could mean danger. The city's economy began to suffer. Evening businesses, restaurants, cafes, cinemas, reported a dramatic drop in customers. People just didn't want to be out after dark. Some businesses had to close. Paranoia set in. Neighbors became suspicious of neighbors. Any man who looked the least bit suspicious could be charged. The police received hundreds of anonymous reports. "My neighbor is acting strange. The man on the street corner looked at me strangely. I saw someone suspicious in the park." Self-defense classes were overcrowded. Sales of locks, chains, and security devices skyrocketed. People were installing new locks on doors, bars on windows. Dusseldorf was turning into a city of fear. And what were the police doing? They worked full-time, but with minimal results. And that drew a lot of criticism. The Dusseldorf police were swamped with cases. They deployed every available detective. They worked 12, 14, 16 hours a day, interviewing witnesses, picking up clues, going all over the city. But the killer was like a ghost, attacking and then disappearing without a trace. The police set up a special investigation team.
They brought in experts from Berlin and other cities. They began to use the then modern methods of forensics: blood trace analysis, fingerprints, comparison of wounds on the victims. But despite all their efforts, they were unable to identify the killer. The media began to criticize the police. "Why can't the police catch one man?" the newspapers asked. "Are the police incompetent? Do we need new police leadership?" The pressure was enormous. Politicians weighed in as well. The city council held crisis meetings. They demanded results from the police. They threatened to remove the police leadership if the killer wasn't caught soon. The public organized protest rallies. People demanded more police patrols on the streets. They wanted the police to do more. Some even called for a curfew. The police tried to respond. They doubled night patrols. They had plainclothes officers at various locations in the city. They followed suspicious persons. But the killer was smart. He could read the situation and adapt. The criticism of the investigative methods was partially justified. The police of that time didn't have the modern technology we have today.
There were no DNA tests, no computer databases, no facial recognition systems. Everything had to be done manually, slowly, methodically. Coordination between different police departments was poor. Information was not shared effectively. Sometimes one team didn't know what the other was doing. This led to duplication of work and missed opportunities. But the police also made mistakes. Some leads weren't investigated properly. Some witnesses weren't questioned in enough detail. Some crime scenes were not properly secured, which meant contamination of evidence. Still, I have to say that the police worked hard. Detectives sacrificed their personal lives. They worked without a break, slept only a few hours, ate their meals on the fly. They were under tremendous pressure to do the best they could with the resources they had. They also put up a reward for information leading to the capture of the killer. The amount was gradually increased until it reached 25,000 marks, a huge sum at that time. But even that didn't help. No one had any useful information. Dusseldorf lived in a nightmare. The murderer was still out there, still attacking, and no one seemed to be able to stop him. Every day could bring another victim. Every night was full of fear. And yet the killer walked among them, looking like everyone else, living a normal life. That was the scariest thing of all. Now we come to how one of history's most dangerous serial killers was finally caught. It's a story where the cutting edge of investigative techniques of the time, a bit of luck, and one key witness came together to change everything. The Dusseldorf police, led by Commissioner Ernst Gannat, worked like never before. Gannat was considered one of the best criminologists of his time and had come from Berlin specifically for this case. He brought with him methods that were then at the very limits of forensic science. Every crime scene was now handled with extreme care. Detectives used magnifying glasses, measured distances, photographed every detail. Unlike today, they didn't have DNA analysis or advanced chemical tests, but they worked with what they had. Fingerprints were one of the main clues the police were following. At the time, dactyloscopy was a relatively new science, but it was already being used in criminalistics. The problem was that Kürten was cautious. He often wore gloves during attacks, or was careful not to touch anything unnecessarily. Partial fingerprints were secured at several crime scenes, but they were not of sufficient quality for unequivocal identification. Blood traces were another key part of the investigation. Experts analyzed blood samples from various crime scenes to try to determine which blood belonged to the victims and which might belong to the perpetrator. At that time, blood typing did not exist to the extent we know it today, but they were able to distinguish human blood from animal blood and establish basic characteristics. Interestingly, they found traces of saliva mixed with blood at some crime scenes. This was consistent with the surviving victims' testimony that their attacker had bitten them. These biological traces were catalogued and kept for possible comparison with the suspect. Analysis of the victim's wounds revealed interesting patterns. Forensic doctors were able to determine that different tools were used in the attacks: knives with different blade lengths, scissors, hammers. The angles of the wounds suggested that the perpetrator was right-handed and of average height. The depth and force of the wounds indicated that he was a physically fit man. The testimony was perhaps the most valuable part of the investigation. The police interviewed hundreds of people, surviving victims, witnesses, people who saw suspects around the crime scenes. Gradually, a profile of the perpetrator began to emerge. He was a middle-aged, well-dressed, decent-looking man who could give the impression of credibility. One of the most important descriptions was provided by a woman named Gertrude Schulte, who survived the attack. She described a man of about 40 years of age, medium height, with dark hair and a calm voice. She said he looked like an ordinary citizen, not someone she was afraid of. Police also systematically mapped the crime scenes. They created a map of Dusseldorf with the locations of all the attacks marked. They tried to find a pattern, a certain area that the perpetrator preferred or a route that he took. It turned out that most of the attacks took place in certain neighborhoods of the city and near parks or abandoned places. Investigators also studied temporal patterns. Most of the attacks took place in the evening or at night, often on weekends. This suggested that the perpetrator probably had a regular job and was attacking in his spare time. The key moment came on the 14th of May in the year 1930. On that day, a young woman named Marie Budlick came to Dusseldorf to visit. She was a 20-year-old maid from Cologne who was looking for work. A man approached her at the station and offered to help her find accommodation. Marie was tired and confused in the big city, so she accepted his offer. The man was Peter Kürten. Kürten led her through the streets of the city and gradually took her to a secluded area, the Grafenberg forest. Marie became afraid because the place seemed too deserted. When she tried to leave, Kürten attacked her. He tried to rape and strangle her. But Marie managed to defend herself and scream so loudly that Kürten became afraid that someone would hear them. At that moment, he did something unexpected. He stopped and said, "Do you remember where I live if you want to turn me in?" Then he let her go. Why did he do that? To this day, it's not entirely clear. Maybe he was turned on by the idea that the victim knew where he lived but couldn't prove it. Maybe it was his arrogance. He thought he was untouchable. Or maybe he just made a mistake. Marie came back to town shocked and traumatized. The next day, she wrote a letter to her friend describing the whole incident. She described the man who had attacked her and, above all, the address of the house where he lived. But then something happened that changed the whole case. Marie had misspelled the address on the envelope. The letter fell into the wrong hands. It was opened by Mrs. Brugman, the postal clerk, who thought it was addressed to her. When Mrs. Brugman read the letter, she immediately understood its meaning. She knew the stories about the Dusseldorf murderer from the newspapers and realized that this could be a breakthrough. She immediately handed the letter over to the police. Inspector Gnott immediately recognized the importance of this testimony. Marie was brought to Dusseldorf and questioned at length. She was able to describe her attacker in great detail and, most importantly, she remembered the way to his house. On the 21st of May, Marie was asked to show the police where her attacker lived. She led them through the streets of Dusseldorf to house number 71 on Mettmannerstrasse. She pointed to a particular entrance and said, "This is where he lives." The police began to discreetly follow the house. They discovered that a married couple, Peter Kürten and his wife Augusta, were living in the flat. Peter worked as a factory worker and, according to the neighbors, was a quiet, decent man. No one would suspect him. On the 24th of May, Commissioner Gnott decided to take action. They were not 100% sure, but the evidence was strong enough. Marie Budlick was able to identify Kürten. They had her detailed description of the attack, and above all, they had the address. That morning, the police surrounded the house on Mettmannerstrasse.
Gnott personally knocked on the door of the apartment. Augusta Kürten answered the door, looking surprised and frightened. "Where is your husband?" Gnott asked. Augusta said that Peter was at work. The police waited. When Kürten returned home, he found several police officers outside his house. He could have fled. He could have tried to resist. Instead, he calmly asked, "What do you want?" "Are you Peter Kürten?" "Yes." "You must follow us to the station for questioning." Kürten nodded his head and went along with the police without resistance. At the police station, Kürten was confronted by Maria Budlick. "Is this the man?" Commissioner Gnott asked. Marie looked at Kürten and said without hesitation, "Yes, that's him. That is the man who attacked me." Kürten at first denied it. He claimed that Marie was confusing him with someone else, that they had never met. But when the police presented him with all the evidence, her detailed description, her knowledge of his address, the description of his apartment, his defense began to crumble. The community's reaction to the arrest was explosive. When the news hit the papers, Dusseldorf seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. "Hope done," screamed the headlines. "End of nightmare," said others. People took to the streets to celebrate. After months of fear and terror, the killer was finally behind bars. Crowds gathered outside the police station. Some shouted that they wanted to see the murderer. Others called for a lynching. The police had to move Kürten to a safer place. As he was being taken away in a police car, people threw stones at the car and shouted abuse. The atmosphere was so tense that the police feared for Kürten's life. The newspapers described the case as the end of an era of terror. They described how the killer was caught thanks to brilliant police work and the courage of a young woman. Marie Budlick became a hero, a woman who helped catch one of the most dangerous killers in history. But the arrest was just the beginning. Kürten, meanwhile, denied guilt for the murders. He admitted only to the attack on Maria, but claimed he had nothing to do with the other crimes. The police knew they would need more evidence to charge him with all the horrific crimes. Commissioner Gnott began to prepare long and detailed interrogations. He knew he was about to face perhaps the most important investigation of his career. The Dusseldorf vampire was behind bars, but his story was only beginning to unfold. Now we come to one of the most sensational trials of the 20th century. What took place in the Dusseldorf courtroom shocked the world and is still used as study material for lawyers, psychologists, and criminologists. The trial began on April 13, 1931. The venue was carefully chosen, a large courtroom in Dusseldorf that could accommodate all the parties, journalists, and the public. The security measures were extraordinary. Police surrounded the building, armed guards were inside, and anyone who wanted to enter had to undergo a thorough check. The presiding judge was Dr. Rose, an experienced lawyer with a reputation for being a fair but strict man. At his side sat two other judges and a jury of jurors. The prosecution was represented by the public prosecutor, Dr. Jürgen, who had the task of proving Kürten's guilt. Kürten's defense attorney was Dr. Alex Weiner, a renowned lawyer who chose to take the case because he believed that everyone has the right to fair representation. The first day was devoted primarily to formal matters. Kürten was formally charged with 9 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. When the judge read the charges, the atmosphere in the courtroom was charged with tension. Kürten sat calmly, dressed in a dark suit, looking more like an official than a serial killer. The courtroom was crowded. The public seats were filled to capacity. People had been waiting outside in long lines since early morning just to get a chance to get in. Among those in attendance were relatives of the victims, journalists from around the world, law students, psychologists, and simply curious people who wanted to see the killer for themselves. The next day, the parade of evidence began. The prosecutor presented the court with a staggering amount of material.
photographs of crime scenes so graphic that several jurors had to look away. Pieces of the victim's clothing, weapons seized from various locations, knives, scissors, hammers. Each item was carefully documented and described. One by one, the forensic experts stepped forward. The medical examiner, Dr. Berg, presented detailed reports of the autopsy findings. He described the wounds, the depth, the angle, the force of the blow. He explained how long the victims probably suffered, how they died. His testimony lasted all day and was so horrifying that the only silence in the courtroom was punctuated by the sobs of the victims' relatives. The third to fifth days were devoted to the testimony of the surviving victims. One by one, women who had been attacked by Kürten but had survived entered the witness box. Their testimony was shocking. They described how he had lured them, how he had treated them politely before suddenly attacking them. They spoke of pain, fear, how they thought they were going to die. Some of these women cried as they testified. One of them, a young girl called Frau Meurer, had to be supported by 2 court representatives because her legs buckled when she saw Kürten sitting just a few meters away from her. Kürten just looked at all these women coldly, without any sign of emotion. The 6th to 10th days of the trial were devoted to the testimony of the relatives of the murdered victims. Mothers, fathers, siblings, they all came to tell about their loved ones who were no longer among the living. The father of little Christine described how he found his daughter dead in bed. The mother of sisters Marie and Louise told how she waited for her daughters to return from a pilgrimage, and instead the police came with the terrifying news. These accounts were emotionally draining for all present. The judge had to call a recess several times because the atmosphere was too tense. Some relatives shouted at Kürten, accused him, cursed him. They had to be escorted out of the courtroom. The 11th to 14th days were devoted to psychiatric and psychological examinations. The most renowned experts from all over Germany came to Dusseldorf. Professor Karl Berg, the leading psychiatrist of the time, presented an extensive study of Kürten's personality. He explained to the court concepts such as sadism, psychopathy, sexual deviance. Berg conducted dozens of hours of interviews with Kürten and created a detailed psychological profile. His conclusions were fascinating and frightening at the same time. He described Kürten as a man with an abnormally developed need to inflict suffering, whose sexual gratification was inextricably linked to violence. Other psychiatrists presented their own analyses. There was debate as to whether Kürten was mentally ill or just evil, whether he was able to distinguish good from evil, whether he could control his impulses or was a slave to them. These questions were crucial in determining his punishment. The 15th to 18th days brought technical expertise. The forensic experts explained how they had linked the various clues to Kürten. A dactyloscopy expert showed how partial fingerprints found at crime scenes matched Kürten's. A blood trace expert explained the complex analysis of the biological material. The 19th and 20th days were reserved for the defense. Dr. Venner did his best. He argued that Kürten was mentally ill and needed treatment, not punishment. He presented his own psychiatric reports, which indicated that Kürten was suffering from severe psychosis. He tried to evoke sympathy, describing Kürten's difficult childhood and the abuse he had suffered. But his efforts were in vain. The evidence was simply too strong, the crimes too horrific. The jury and the judges seemed unconvinced. The 21st day of the trial brought something everyone had been waiting for: Kürten's own testimony. When he took the stand, the courtroom was absolutely silent. Prosecutor Jorgen asked him directly, "Mr. Kürten, do you confess to the charges?" Kürten looked at him calmly and said, "Yes, I confess to all the charges." There was a collective gasp in the courtroom. Although many people expected a confession, hearing it from his own mouth was shocking.
Then something even more frightening followed. Kürten began to speak, and he talked, with a cool, almost matter-of-fact intonation. He described his crimes in minute detail. He showed no pity, no sorrow, no emotion. "When I saw the blood, I felt a thrill," he said calmly. "It was like a drug. The more blood, the stronger the thrill." He described how he watched his victims, how he picked out the most vulnerable, how he lured them into a trap. He talked about drinking the blood from the wounds. "The taste of blood on my lips brought me orgasm," he said without the slightest hesitation. "It was the most intense pleasure I have ever experienced." The people in the courtroom listened in horror. Kürten also described his motives. "I wanted the whole city to suffer," he said. "I wanted to cause fear, chaos. When I read in the newspapers about the panic I caused, it excited me almost as much as the murders themselves." He explained how he returned to the crime scenes. "I stood among the people looking at the bodies. I listened to their shocked comments. I saw parents crying over their children, and that excited me. I went home and masturbated at the memory of their suffering." He also talked about his fantasies.
"I imagined mass disasters, fires, explosions, accidents. I imagined hundreds of people suffering at once. That was my biggest fantasy, to cause suffering on a massive scale." When he spoke of specific victims, his description was horrifyingly detailed. He remembered each of them, their names, what they looked like, what they were wearing, how they reacted when he attacked them. He described their last moments with an almost photographic memory. "Little Gertrude was screaming for help," he recalled. "She tried to run away, but she was too weak. When I cut her throat, blood spurted out like a fountain. It was beautiful." The way he said it, without emotion, as if he were describing an ordinary daily activity, was perhaps the most frightening of all. When he spoke of the adult victims, his tone did not change. "Mrs. Reuter tried to bargain about me. She offered me money, jewelry, anything. But I didn't want money. I wanted to see her fear, her pain. So I hit her with a hammer, again and again." The judge asked him, "Do you feel any remorse?" Kürten thought and then said, "No, I feel no pity. Maybe I should, but I don't. The only regret I have is that I was caught." Death sentence and execution on 2nd July 1931. After 3 weeks of trial, it was time for closing arguments. Prosecutor Jorgen spoke for almost 2 hours. He summarized all the evidence, all the testimonies. He described Kürten as the most dangerous criminal in modern history and demanded the highest possible punishment: death. Defense attorney Wehner made one more attempt to save his client. He argued mental illness, an inability to control his actions, but his words rang hollow after all was said. The jury retired to deliberate. She returned after less than 3 hours. The verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. Judge Rowe stood and began to read the verdict. His voice was firm and clear. "Peter Kürten, this court finds you guilty of 9 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. Your actions are so horrific, so inhuman, that you deserve no mercy. I sentence you to death by guillotine 9 times. 9 times. 1 death sentence for each murder." This was symbolic. Although he could not be executed 9 times, the sentence emphasized the seriousness of his crimes. Kürten heard the sentence without reaction. He didn't beg for mercy, he didn't scream, he didn't cry. He simply nodded and allowed himself to be taken away. An appeal was filed but quickly dismissed. On the 2nd of July 1931, at 6 o'clock in the morning,
Peter Kürten was taken to the execution ground in Cologne. They said his last words were, "After what I have done, I deserve death. I only wonder if I will hear the sound of my own blood when my head is cut off. That would be the ultimate pleasure." Then the guillotine fell. The Düsseldorf vampire was dead. His era of terror was over. Immediately after his arrest, Kürten was subjected to a series of medical examinations. A team of psychiatrists and psychologists were tasked with answering one crucial question: is Peter Kürten mentally ill, or is he simply an evil man with full knowledge of his actions? Professor Karl Berg, who led the psychiatric investigation, spent more than 100 hours in personal interviews with Kürten. Berg was fascinated by Kürten's ability to talk about his crimes with absolute calm. He took detailed notes, recorded the interviews, and analyzed Kürten's every word. In his first report, Berg described Kürten as a classic example of a sadistic personality with necrophilic tendencies. He explained that Kürten's sexuality had been distorted and associated with violence from an early age. Berg identified several key characteristics of Kürten's psyche. The first was the absence of empathy. Kürten was unable to empathize with the suffering of others. When Berg played Kürten recordings of crying mothers who had lost their children, Kürten remained completely indifferent. He even said, "Their crying is like music. It moves me." The second characteristic was the need for dominance and control. Kürten described how the feeling of absolute power over life and death excited him. "When you hold a knife to someone else's throat, you are like God," he said. "You decide life and death. That's the most powerful feeling in the world." The third was the fetishization of blood. Berg ran a series of tests where he showed Kürten different pictures. When he saw pictures of blood, wounds, or violence, his bodily reactions were measurable: a quickened pulse, dilated pupils, increased body temperature. Berg described this as a pathological fixation on hematophagy, drinking blood. Dr. Scioli, another leading psychiatrist, focused on Kürten's ability to lead a double life. In his report, he wrote, "The subject shows an extraordinary capacity for dissociation. He can murder a child in the morning and sit with his wife at tea in the afternoon as if nothing had happened." This ability to separate different aspects of his personality is extremely rare and disturbing. Scioli also identified what he called a compensatory mechanism. Kürten was extremely polite and courteous in public. He wore good clothes, went to church, and was polite to his neighbors. Scioli believed that this behavior was a conscious mask that Kürten used to hide his true self. Dr. Rather specialized in sexual pathology. His report contained a detailed analysis of Kürten's sexuality. He described how Kürten masturbated while recalling his crimes, how he orgasmed while killing, how his sexual fantasies were exclusively violent. Rather conducted an experiment where he read Kürten different scenarios: romantic scenes, ordinary sexual situations, and then scenes of violence. Only during the scenes of violence did Kürten exhibit sexual arousal. Rather documented this as the absolute union of sexuality with aggression that makes the subject permanently dangerous. All three experts agreed on the diagnosis. Kürten was a sadistic psychopath with parasexual deviations. But the key question remained: is it a mental illness or a character flaw? Here we come to the most controversial part of the whole expert assessment. The defense, of course, argued that Kürten was mentally ill and therefore insane. The prosecution argued the opposite, that Kürten was fully sane and responsible for his actions. Professor Berg submitted an extensive report to the court. He explained that although Kürten showed clear signs of psychopathy and sadism, these conditions did not render him insane in the legal sense. Berg argued, "The subject fully understands the difference between right and wrong. His actions are planned, methodical, and controlled. He is not in the grip of hallucinations or delusions. His contact with reality is fully preserved. Berg went on to explain that Kürten exhibits what is called instrumental aggression, violence used as a means to an end, in this case, sexual gratification. This differs from reactive aggression, which is impulsive and uncontrolled. Kürten's violence was always premeditated. Berg cited several points as evidence. First, Kürten was able to plan his attacks. He chose his victims, his locations, his time. He carried weapons, all of which requires foresight and planning. Second, Kürten was able to stop when he was in danger of being caught. He interrupted the attack several times when he heard footsteps or voices. This shows a capacity for self-control. Third, Kürten actively concealed his actions, hiding bodies, covering his tracks, lying to the police. This shows an awareness that his actions were wrong and criminal. Dr. Scioli came to a similar conclusion but added another dimension. In his report, he wrote, "The subject is not insane in the traditional sense. He is not suffering from schizophrenia, manic depression, or any other classic mental illness. His problem is deeper, and in some ways more frightening. He is a person who has chosen to be evil." Scioli was explaining the concept of moral insanity, which was controversial at the time. He argued that some people have a disturbed moral compass, but their cognitive functions are intact. Kürten knows that killing is wrong according to the laws of society. It just doesn't bother him. He even considers it right for himself. But not all experts agree. Dr. Wehmeyer, a psychiatrist hired by the defense, offered a different opinion. He argued that Kürten's behavioral extremes must be considered manifestations of mental illness. No sane person could have done what Kürten did, Wehmeyer argued. The sheer brutality and frequency of his acts is evidence of a pathology that goes beyond mere character defects. Wehmeyer pointed to Kürten's hallucinations and fantasies. Kürten described how movies full of violence and blood were constantly running in his head. Wehmeyer interpreted this as a form of psychosis. He also argued that Kürten's compulsion to kill was beyond his control, that he was literally a slave to his impulses. Another defense psychiatrist, Dr. Mueller, focused on the neurological aspects. He ran a series of tests on Kürten's brain function. He discovered some abnormalities in Kürten's reactions which, in his opinion, indicated organic brain damage. Mueller speculated that Kürten may have had a tumor or other physical abnormality in his brain that was affecting his behavior. But these arguments were weak. Professor Berg systematically refuted them. To Wehmeyer's argument, he replied, "Fantasies of violence are not in themselves evidence of psychosis. Many people have dark fantasies but do not act on them. Kürten always had a choice, and he always chose to act." On Mueller's neurological theory, Berg noted, "The abnormalities in the tests are minimal and could be explained in many ways. There is no evidence of a tumor or other organic disease. Moreover, even if there were organic impairment, that in itself would not call into question his ability to know right from wrong." The court ultimately sought an opinion from an independent panel of 3 psychiatrists, who were not associated with either the defense or the prosecution. This panel spent weeks studying all available material and conducted its own interviews with Kürten. Their conclusion was unequivocal. Peter Kürten is a sadistic psychopath with serious character defects. Nevertheless, he is fully sane in the legal sense. He understands the nature and consequences of his actions. He is able to control his behavior when it is in his interest to do so. He is fully responsible for his crimes and should be tried as such. Kürten's case has become a landmark in forensic psychiatry. Professor Berg later published a book called Der Sadist, which became the standard text for the study of sadism and serial killers. The case sparked a debate about the nature of evil. Are serial killers sick or evil? Can they be cured, or must they be isolated from society forever? These questions are still relevant today. Berg's work with Kürten helped define the modern concept of psychopathy. He identified key characteristics: lack of empathy, superficial charm, manipulative behavior, lack of remorse. These characteristics later became the basis for diagnostic tools such as the PCLR, psychopathy checklist. The case also demonstrated the importance of distinguishing between mental illness and character disorder. Kürten was not insane in the traditional sense. He was not hallucinating, delusional, or detached from reality. But his personality was fundamentally distorted in a way that made him permanently dangerous. The methodology Berg used, long structured interviews, psychological testing, behavioral analysis, became a model for future forensic investigations. His meticulous documentation of Kürten's words and actions provided an inexhaustible source of data for research. The case also highlighted the limitations of psychiatry. Even with all their expertise, experts could not fully explain why Kürten had become what he was. Genetics? Environment? Trauma? Probably a combination of all these factors, but the exact mechanisms remained a mystery. Today, almost 100 years later, psychiatrists are still studying the case of Peter Kürten. His detailed descriptions of his motives and feelings provide a rare glimpse into the mind of a serial killer. Most such criminals either refuse to talk or lie. Kürten spoke plainly and seemed to be telling the truth. Perhaps because he enjoyed shocking experts with his candor. His case reminds us that the human mind is capable of incredible evil, and that understanding this evil is the first step to preventing it. Kürten's case has revolutionized the way police approach the investigation of serial crimes. The Düsseldorf police were the first to systematically apply methods that later became standard worldwide. Commissioner Ernst Gannat introduced the concept of the Mordkommission, a specialized homicide team. Before this case, murders were investigated like other crimes, without any special focus. Gannat understood that serial murders required a different approach. He created a team of detectives who dedicated themselves to this case alone, with no other distractions. This model later spread throughout Europe and America. Gannat also introduced a centralized documentation system. Every lead, every witness, every photograph was carefully cataloged and stored in one central location. He created a huge filing cabinet where any information could be quickly retrieved. This may sound obvious today, but at the time it was revolutionary. Before that, different police stations kept their own records, and often information was lost or not shared. Geographical mapping became a key technique. Gannat had a large map of Düsseldorf made, marking each crime scene with colored pins. Different colors represented different types of attacks. This visualization helped identify patterns, areas where attacks were concentrated, possible escape routes for the perpetrator, places where he might live. Today, this is called geographic profiling and is a standard tool in serial crime investigations. Gannat also introduced the systematic use of the media. Instead of trying to keep information secret, he strategically shared it with journalists. He published descriptions of the suspect, pleaded for the public's help, and warned potential victims. He created a hotline where people could call with information. This approach, working with the public instead of isolating them, proved crucial and is still used today. Forensic science has taken a giant leap forward. Forensic doctors began documenting the wounds on victims in much greater detail. They made precise drawings, measured wound angles, analyzed the depth and direction of the stab wounds. This data helped create a profile of the killer: his height, his dominant hand, his physical strength. These methods later evolved into modern forensic pathology. Forensic photographers began to use standardized procedures. Each crime scene was photographed from multiple angles, to scale, under different lighting conditions. These photographs became critical evidence in a trial. The standards that were developed during this investigation have influenced crime scene photography worldwide. Psychological profiling was born out of this case. Although the term profiler did not yet exist, What psychiatrists like Berg were doing was essentially profiling. They were trying to understand the psychology of the perpetrator, to predict his next steps, to identify his characteristics. The FBI later created its famous Behavioral Analysis Unit based on these principles. International cooperation between police forces expanded. Gnott contacted police in other German cities and abroad, sharing information, asking for advice. He understood that serial killers often operate in multiple jurisdictions, and that cooperation was key. This led to the creation of the International Police Organization, Interpol, which was formally founded in 1923, but expanded its activities thanks to cases like Kürten's. Witness protection became a priority. After the Maria Budlik incident, when her letter accidentally ended up in another person's possession, the police established strict protocols to protect the identity of witnesses. Marie had to be protected from possible retaliation and also from the media, who constantly wanted to question her. Police training changed. Academies began teaching specific courses on serial crimes, the psychology of criminals, investigative techniques. The Kürten case became a study material for generations of detectives. The Peter Kürten case had a huge impact on art and popular culture. His story has fascinated and horrified artists around the world. Fritz Lang, one of the greatest film directors of the time, was deeply influenced by the Kürten case. In the year 1931, while Kürten was still on trial, he began filming the movie Eine Stadt sucht einen Mörder. A city looking for a murderer. The film tells the story of a serial child killer who terrorizes a German town. Although Lang officially claimed that the film is not directly about Kürten, the similarities are unquestionable. Lang's film was revolutionary in many ways. It was one of the first sound films in Germany, and Lang used sound in an ingenious way. The main character, the murderer Hans Beckert, whistles a tune that becomes his trademark. The film also showed the psychology of the killer, his inner conflict, his inability to control his impulses. This was something new. The killers in earlier films were simply evil, without psychological depth. The film also showed society's reaction to the serial killer: panic, paranoia, lynch mob. The scene where the city's underworld organizes its own hunt for the killer because the police are ineffective reflects the real atmosphere in Dusseldorf during the Kürten era of terror. Became a classic of world cinema and influenced countless later films about serial killers. Literature has also been inspired by the case. German writer Alfred Doblin wrote an essay on Kürten and the nature of evil. British author Patrick Hamilton used themes from the case in his psychological thrillers. The American writer Thomas Harris, author of The Silence of the Lambs, later admitted that Kürten was one of the inspirations for the character of Hannibal Lecter, an intelligent, sophisticated killer who could appear perfectly normal. Kürten's case has appeared in countless true crime books. The first was Berg's Der Sadist in 1932, which was part scientific study, part sensational narrative. The book became a bestseller and was translated into many languages. It created a genre that combined scientific analysis with suspenseful narrative. In the 1950s, the American writer Robert Bloch wrote the novel Psycho, inspired partly by Kürten and partly by the American murderer Ed Gein. Alfred Hitchcock later filmed the book in his famous thriller. The character of Norman Bates, a seemingly normal man who leads a double life, bears Kürten's traits. Comic books and graphic novels have also used Kürten's story. In the 1980s, the graphic novel A Contract with God and Other Tenement Stories was published, which contained a story inspired by Kürten. The character of the Joker in Batman comics has some characteristics inspired by Kürten: the ability to cause chaos and fear in the city, and the joy in the suffering of others. Television series about true crime cases have devoted entire episodes to Kürten. The BBC produced a documentary series, The Mind of a Murderer, where one episode was dedicated to Kürten. The American station A&E included him in their biography series. German television has made several documentaries and even a feature film about the case. The music world was also inspired. The German industrial band Einstürzende Neubauten named one of their songs Der Tod ist ein Dandy, Death is a Dandy, referring to Kürten's elegant appearance. British Gothic rock band Bauhaus had a song with references to the Dusseldorf vampire. Metal and punk bands used Kürten's story as a symbol of social decay. The visual arts also responded. German expressionist painters created a series of paintings inspired by the atmosphere of fear in Dusseldorf. Otto Dix, known for his disturbing portraits, painted a series of paintings called Der Lustmörder, the sexual murderer, which was clearly inspired by Kürten. Today, almost a century after Kürten's crimes, his case still fascinates experts and the public, but the perception has changed significantly. Modern criminologists study Kürten as a textbook example of a certain type of serial killer. He belongs to the category of organized killers, planned, methodical, capable of leading a normal life. This distinguishes him from disorganized killers, who are impulsive and chaotic. FBI profilers have included Kürten's case in their database of serial killers. His characteristics, escalation of violence, variety of victims, ability to manipulate, are used in training new agents. Kürten is considered an early example of a power-assertive killer, someone who kills to demonstrate his power. Forensic psychiatrists consider Kürten's case the gold standard for the study of sadism. His candor in describing his motives provided a rare insight. Most serial killers are either silent or lying. Kürten spoke frankly, perhaps because it gave him a thrill to shock the experts. His interviews with Berg are still studied in medical schools. Sexologists analyze Kürten's paraphilia, sexual arousal from blood and violence. His case helped define the category of hematolagnia, sexual fetishism associated with blood. It is also studied in the context of piquerism, sexual arousal from stabbing or cutting. Neuroscientists speculate about the possible biological basis of Kürten's behavior. Modern brain imaging techniques have shown that psychopaths have different activity in certain brain regions, particularly the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. Although Kürten's brain is no longer available for study, his case study helps to generate hypotheses about the neurobiology of violent behavior. The public perception of Kürten is mixed. He is still a controversial figure in Germany. Dusseldorf tries to distance itself from its dark past, but tourists still come looking for places associated with his crimes. There are dark tourism tours that take visitors to the sites of the crimes, although many of these sites have already been rebuilt. The true crime community online is fascinated by Kürten. There are dozens of websites, forums, podcasts dedicated to his case. YouTube channels like mine analyze various aspects of his crimes. Reddit has threads where people discuss the details of the case, speculate on unsolved questions. Ethical debates continue. Should we glorify serial killers by making movies and TV shows about them? Isn't this fascination unhealthy? Some critics argue that the true crime industry exploits victims and their families for entertainment. Others say that studying these cases is important to prevent future crimes. Academics study Kürten in the context of the Weimar Republic, a period of political instability, economic crisis, and social change in Germany between the two world wars. Some historians argue that Kürten's crimes were a symptom of a broader social pathology, a country that had lost its moral anchors. Feminist analyses examine the gendered aspect of his crimes. Most of his victims were women and children, vulnerable members of society. His ability to exploit trust, present himself as a protector and then attack, reflects broader patterns of gender violence. Comparative studies have compared Kürten to other serial killers,
Jack the Ripper, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Andre Chikatilo. What do they have in common? How are they different? These analyses help create a typology of serial killers and a better understanding of their motivations. Prevention programs use the Kürten case as a cautionary example. His childhood of violence and abuse is used to argue for better child protection, intervention in dysfunctional families, and access to mental health services. Although not every abused child becomes a murderer, Kürten's case shows how devastating the consequences can be. Kürten's legacy is complex and controversial. It is a symbol of evil, but also an important case for science. It is a source of fascination, but also a warning. His story reminds us that a monster can look like any of us. And that is perhaps the most frightening lesson of all. And here we are at the end of this incredibly dark story. I know it's been a difficult journey, and I thank you for sticking with me to the end. Now I'd like to share my final thoughts with you and ask you a few questions that have never left me while preparing this video. Looking back on this whole story now, there are certain moments that stand out and which I think are worth highlighting again, not as a reiteration of facts, but as a reflection on their meaning. The first crucial moment that comes to mind is the question of the visibility of evil. Imagine that you live in Dusseldorf in the year 1930. You go to work every day, you meet your neighbors, you shop in the stores. And among all these ordinary people, there is someone who looks perfectly normal, but hides something so terrifying that you can't even imagine it. I think that's one of the scariest aspects of the whole case. The fact that evil doesn't have to look like evil. It doesn't have horns. It doesn't have a tail. It doesn't wear a dark cloak. It can look like your neighbor, your colleague, the person you'd hold the door for on the street. This thought leads me to think about our ability to recognize danger. How many times a day do we make decisions based on how someone looks? Do we trust someone because they have a nice smile and decent clothes? Or do we fear someone because they look suspicious? This case shows us how tricky our intuition can be and how important it is not to give in to stereotypes. Another moment that I think is crucial is the power of one witness. An army of police officers, hundreds of detectives, thousands of hours of investigation. And in the end, the case was solved thanks to the courage of one young woman who was not afraid to speak out. That's an incredibly powerful message. Each of us can be the one to make a difference. Every voice is important. How many times do we say, "What can I, as one person, change?" Well, this case shows us that one person can change everything. Then there is the question of justice versus revenge. When you watch the public reaction, the crowds calling for lynching, people throwing stones at the police car, you see the fine line between the desire for justice and the desire for revenge. It is interesting to see how society behaves in moments of extreme stress. Are we losing our civilized values? Or are we showing our true nature? This is a question worth pondering. I am also fascinated by the paradox of professional interest versus human tragedy. For scientists and experts, this case has been a goldmine of information. For the families of the victims, it was the worst nightmare of their lives. How do we balance these two perspectives? How can we study evil without forgetting the human suffering it caused? This is an ethical question that I also struggle with when making these videos. Another aspect that caught my attention is the role of the media. The newspapers of the time were overdoing it with sensational headlines, publishing morbid details, creating an atmosphere of panic. Does that sound familiar? Today's media do exactly the same thing. This case shows us that the media have enormous power. They can help solve a case by informing the public, but they can also cause harm by creating hysteria. Where is the line between informing and sensationalism?
I also think about what this case says about society as a whole. Dusseldorf at that time was a city in crisis. Economic problems, political instability, social tensions. Does evil arise more easily in such conditions? Or would someone like Kürten become a murderer under any circumstances? Is evil a product of society or an individual choice? It is probably a combination of both, but the ratio of these factors is the subject of endless debate. Then there is the question of prevention. Could anything have been done differently? Could lives have been saved? If someone had intervened in his or her childhood, if the system had worked better, if social services had been better, would it have made a difference? Or was Kürten simply bad regardless of the circumstances? These questions are important because they make us think about how we can prevent similar tragedies in the future. I am also fascinated by human psychology in a broader sense. Why are we as a society so fascinated by serial killers? Why is there an entire industry built on true crime stories? I track my own viewership numbers and see that videos about dark cases get the most views. Why is that? What does that say about us? Are we morbid? Or is it something deeper, a need to understand the darkness so we can better appreciate the light? And now I want to turn directly to you, my dear viewers. I'd like to ask you a few questions, and I hope you'll write your answers in the comments. I'm really interested in what you think. The first question is a practical one. If you were a detective in the year 1930, and you only had the technology of that time, no DNA tests, no computers, no cameras, how would you have approached the investigation? What would have been your priority? Would you have focused on collecting physical evidence? Or would you focus more on interviews and creating a psychological profile? Would you go to the media asking for help? Or would you try to keep the information secret so as not to reveal what you know to the perpetrator? Imagine you have hundreds of suspects and limited resources. How would you prioritize them? How would you decide who to question first? What criteria would you use? And how would you deal with the pressure from the public and the media pressuring you to possibly solve quickly? The next question is an ethical one. If you had the opportunity to talk to a murderer like Kürten, someone who is willing to talk openly about his crimes, what would you ask him? Would you wonder why, or rather, how? Would you try to understand him, or would you not care because no explanation can justify his actions? Is it even important to understand a murderer's motives, or is it enough to simply know that he is guilty? And here's the hard question. If you were a juror in this case, and you heard arguments about his difficult childhood, about possible mental illness, about all the factors that shaped him, would that affect your verdict? Does anyone deserve compassion despite unforgivable actions? Or are some things just so horrible that no context plays a role? What if you were the psychiatrist examining him? Could you remain objective, or would you be emotionally affected by his story and his actions? How do you deal with the fact that you have to treat a monster as a patient? And if you found that their narrative was giving you nightmares, which was indeed happening to some professionals, would you continue on, or would you withdraw from the case? Here's a hypothetical situation. Imagine you were living in Dusseldorf at the time of these crimes. You are the mother or father of a young child. How much would you limit your child's life because of fear? Would you let him out at all? How do you balance security with the need to live a normal life? And what if your child protested that all other children had more freedom? Would you back down? And what if you were a journalist? How many details would you publish? Would you have a moral responsibility to protect the public from the worst details? Or is it your job to report the truth, no matter how horrifying? Where is the line between informing the public and causing panic? And what if an editor told you, "We need a sensational headline or the competition will beat us to it"? What would you do?
Here's a controversial question. If you had the chance to prevent Kürten's birth, to travel through time and change history, would you do it? At first glance, the answer seems simple. Of course, yes, you would save dozens of lives. But then you remember that his case changed criminology, helped save perhaps thousands of lives in the future thanks to the methods that were developed. Is it morally acceptable to let evil exist if it does some good? This is a philosophical question that has no easy answer. What if you were Auguste, his wife? You live with someone for years, share a bed with them, eat meals with them, and all the while they are a serial killer. When you find out, how would you feel? Would you blame yourself for not recognizing it? Or would you feel like a victim of his manipulation? And what would you do with the information? Would you go to the police immediately? Or would you have an internal conflict over loyalty to your husband? And now comes my most important appeal to all of you who have put up with me up to this point. I appreciate each and every one of you because I know this was not an easy video to watch. It took time, it was emotionally taxing, and it may have even upset you a little. But I believe it's important to talk about these things. If you found this video interesting and want to see more content like this, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. It really helps the algorithm to show my videos to other people who might appreciate them. And believe me, every thumbs up I see makes me happy because I know my work is meaningful. Even more important is channel subscriptions. When you become a subscriber, YouTube will notify you when a new video comes out. I'm working on a whole series about fascinating crime cases from around the world. We have cases from the Czech Republic, Slovakia, America, Japan, a really diverse mix. Some are historical, like this one. Others are more recent. But they all have something in common. They are stories that teach us something about human nature, about society, about justice. And please, ring the bell. It's the little icon next to the subscribe button. If you turn it on, you'll get a notification as soon as a new video comes out. Because sometimes YouTube can be a bit erratic and won't show your favorite channels in the featured channels, so the bell is the best way to make sure you don't miss anything. Now for the most important part, the comments. I really want to hear your opinions. I won't lie to you, I read every single comment you write. Sometimes it takes a few days because there can be a lot of them, but I try to respond to as many of them as possible. Your comments inspire me, give me new ideas, help me understand what you are interested in. Let me know what you think about this case. Did it shock you? Did you learn anything new? Do you have a theory or perspective of your own that I haven't mentioned? Maybe you are from Dusseldorf and know some local stories related to this case. Or do you have personal experience of something similar? Perhaps you live in a place where a well-known crime happened. Share it with me and other viewers. And if you have suggestions for other cases I should cover, be sure to email them to me. I'm making a list of all your suggestions and trying to incorporate them into future videos. Your voice really counts, and this channel is as much yours as it is mine. One more request. If you liked the video, please share it. Send it to your friends who like true crime. Share it on social media. It will help the channel grow and allow me to create more and better content for you. The more of us there are, the more lively discussions we'll have in the comments, and the more perspectives we'll hear. If you want to support the channel even more, you can become a member or send super thanks. It's not necessary. All my content will remain free for everyone. But if you have the opportunity and want to help, I really appreciate it. This income helps me invest in better equipment, better research, and sometimes travel to the places I talk about. You can also follow me on social media where I share behind-the-scenes content, short stories in between videos, and interact with you in real time. Links can be found in the video descriptions. I have an Instagram where I post photos from preparing videos, TikTok where I share shorter true crime facts,
and Twitter, where I discuss current cases. And finally, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your support. Thank you for not being afraid to dive into these dark stories with me. I know there are a million other things you could be doing, and you chose to spend time with me. That means more to me than you can imagine. The next video will be about a completely different case, but just as fascinating. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you are too. So see you next time. Have a great time, and remember, the world is full of secrets, and we'll be uncovering them together one by one. Bye for now, and stay safe.